Hey everyone, Jeremy here. And guys, we have a return guest by popular demand. Almost 100,000 of you have watched his first interview on YouTube and have actually demanded that he come back on the show. I reached out to him and said, Richard, you've got to come back. The people want to hear from you again. They're very interested in what you have to say. Last time, if you guys didn't hear the full episode, I'd recommend you go back and look at it. We talked about George Soros as a British asset. We're going to talk about that a little bit more here, but we're also going to bring that into some other issues that we're dealing with that really relate to that and the British Empire directly. So our guest today is Richard Poe. Richard, thank you so much for coming back on today, sir.
Thanks, Jeremy. Always a pleasure.
So the thing I wanted to go back to, because a lot of our YouTube commenters were a little incredulous on the idea of the UK the UK government still seeming like it's a threatening thing. And I guess from your viewpoint, why should we still be so concerned about the UK? Because a lot of people are like, oh, their time is behind. The sun is set in the British Empire. But you very strongly had connected Soros and a lot of what's happening to the British government. Why should we still be concerned, Richard?
Well, first of all, if you're concerned about the UN, if you're concerned about the World Economic Forum, if you're concerned about all of these transnational institutions of global government that are presently making our lives miserable, then you need to be concerned with the British Empire, the British Commonwealth, or whatever you want to call it, because they are one and the same. There was a book written in 1926 by a guy named Alfred Zimmern, and he was a British gentleman who was part of the so-called Round Table movement. The Round Table movement was a movement in the, it started in the late 19th century, really got going in the early 20th century, but basically it was a movement of very high-level British statesmen and other elites who understood that the times were changing and the British Empire had to change, that it had to stop being an empire based on acquiring colonial real estate, and it had to find some other means to wield power in the world. So in this book, The Third British Empire, this man Zimmern basically said that the League of Nations, which at that time was the closest we had to a global government, he said the League of Nations was the Third British Empire, basically. He said it was through this League of Nations, which, by the way, was a British creation from the get-go. It was something the British had been expressly planning for more than 100 years. By the time,
and wasn't Woodrow Wilson a big part of the implementation of that as well? Because I know people have said that the League of Nations was like a Wilson dream in some ways.
Actually, that was a propaganda position that in which Wilson and his handler, Colonel Edward House, were fully cooperative with the British, but it was not really Wilson's idea, not at all. It's very, very clear that the British were not only planning a League of Nations, or sometimes they'd call it by other names, a Peace League or the Parliament of Man. Tennyson was writing poems about the Parliament of Man back in the 1830s. And it was not only something they were planning and talking about in public writings, but there were what we now call NGOs. There were organizations started pushing for it long before Woodrow Wilson was born. And in fact, what happened is in 1916, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, wrote a letter to Colonel Edward House, who was Woodrow Wilson's closest advisor, basically saying to him, look, we want to start this League of Nations, but it won't look right if the British Empire is pushing this idea. People will take it the wrong way. It would look much better coming from an American president from a so-called neutral country that everybody trusts, and everybody did trust us at that time. Seems strange to remember now. And so he said, what we would like is for President Wilson to propose this idea of a League of Nations and to pretend that it's his idea. And Colonel House basically said, sure, no problem. I'll talk to the president. We'll get him to do it. And it's one of the curious facts of history that this Colonel House had that kind of power to manipulate Woodrow Wilson. He had a strange kind of mesmerism that he practiced on Wilson. It's not really clear why he had the president's trust and obedience to that extent. That there's all kinds of theories about it. Some of them get into the occult and things like that. But for whatever reason, he undeniably had a strange Svengali-like hold on the president. And this was very significant because Colonel House was, in fact, being run by British intelligence at that time. His handler was a guy named Sir William Wiseman, who was then the station chief for British intelligence in the United States. And they were very, very good friends, this William Wiseman and Colonel House. And we have a rich archive of now published writings, letters between House and Sir Edward Grey and Sir William Wiseman, all plotting together how to manipulate Woodrow Wilson and get him to do what they wanted. And this becomes very significant when you realize that it was during Wilson's administration and it was under the Svengali-like influence of Colonel House that the income tax was passed here, that we switched over to the Federal Reserve System in 1913, that we entered World War I after Wilson had run on a campaign saying he kept us out of war. Mm-hmm. And then Wilson obediently, as he had been instructed to do by Sir Edward Grey and Colonel House, Wilson then obediently became the champion of this League of Nations, which was completely following the British plan and blueprint for this international organization through and through. But that's where the plan failed because the U.S. Mm-hmm. Senate scrutinized it very closely. They brought in expert witnesses, including a number of prominent Irish-American intellectuals who were very knowledgeable about the workings of the British Empire. These were people, for the most part, these Irish Americans, people involved with the Irish Republican movement at the time, the struggle for Irish independence was going on. And one man in particular who was a New York State Supreme Court judge, his name was Cohalan, Daniel Cohalan. He was extremely eloquent in his testimony before the Senate, and in which he basically said that the purpose of the League of Nations was to bring the United States back into the British system as essentially a member of the British Empire. And this was an explicit goal of the British Roundtable movement, which was really, I mean, we call it a movement. It was famously exposed by Georgetown University professor Carroll Quigley, whom you may have heard of.
Yes.
But he in two books that he wrote, he exposed this roundtable and its agenda to first of all, to create World War I, to create a world war which would leave the British Empire in a dominant position in the world, as indeed it did, and in the process to bring the United States back into the British system in some way or another, but preferably what the Roundtable people wanted was to bring it in as a sort of dominion with the same kind of status as Canada or Australia or one of the other English-speaking dominions. And there were different ideas about this. But my point is to those of your audience who are skeptical that Britain could wield such kind of power or could be this kind of threat, is this. My answer is the simple fact that if you read their writings, if you read The Americanization of the World by William T. Stead, for example, he was a British operative, a journalist actually, but also apparently an intelligence operative, and he was Cecil Rhodes's handler. And he wrote this book, The Americanization of the World, in which he basically called for the union of the United States and Britain. And this had already been, this idea had already been pushed very hard by such men as Andrew Carnegie, the great steel magnate, often described as American, although in fact he was Scottish, and in fact he never got his American citizenship. He always remained a loyal subject of the crown. He used his vast wealth to start the Carnegie Peace Foundation, allegedly dedicated to the cause of peace, but actually dedicated to the cause of the Round Table and to its cause of what they called imperial federation, of bringing the British Empire into a closer sort of federal union and including the United States in it. So all of this was planned and basically announced publicly through books, lectures, articles. And we can read these books today, and it's very clear what the British were proposing. It's very clear what they were planning is to create a world united under British rule, governed through bodies such as the League of Nations, which pretended to be international bodies, that somehow allowed the nations of the world to democratically vote and on issues they had in common, but in fact was rigged to do the will of Great Britain and its Commonwealth. And so we can look at those plans laid out very clearly, and then we can look at the world today, and it's crystal clear that what those men said they were going to do has been done. The world we have today, whether it's the World Economic Forum, the United Nations system, and all of these supranational authorities, the WHO, et cetera, that are now in our faces telling us how to live our lives, these are part of the global government which the British Round Table movement foresaw and engineered and managed to manipulate the United States to get involved with. And these manipulations took place on the level of intelligence. They were carried out by British intelligence officers, such as especially the one I mentioned before, Sir William Wiseman, who, by the way, has been called by British historians the greatest agent of influence that the United Kingdom ever had. And that is very high praise for an intelligence officer of MI6, which I think is by far the greatest intelligence service in the world, the most effective.
Let me ask you this then, Richard, because that's the question I have then is, I guess, looking at the head of the snake, right? If we look at the head of the snake, there's been comments from some of our listeners saying, King Charles, which I really, in my opinion, I'm not an expert. I don't think the crown has that much power anymore. I think it is more of the intelligence services and things like that. And if you look at people like, Sir Robert Maxwell and the connection he had to intelligence, and he also had to Epstein and his daughter Ghislaine, and you look at what we had recently with everything that was happened with Trump, Christopher Steele, that also came out of the UK. So I guess looking at it, who is actually the real head of the snake now? Like who is actually that head?
Well, the short answer is I don't know, but I would say, given what we know about history in general and human nature, the head of the snake would not be an individual or even a group of individuals. It would be a group of families. This is how oligarchies work, through families. And who are those families? Well, my research has not advanced to the point where I'm ready to name them, but I will tell you that that same Judge Daniel Cohalan, who testified in 1919 before the U.S. Senate, he said at that time that the head of the snake, as you put it, in Great Britain was the Cecil family. The Cecils are an old noble family. We're going back at least to the time of Henry VIII, and they have been extremely influential throughout British history. One of them was involved in the so-called Union of the Crowns, where they brought the Scottish and British crown together, resulting in what we now call the United Kingdom today. They at every generation, they were involved in things at that level of importance. And at the time, Judge Cohalan testified against them, against this Cecil family before the U.S. Senate. One Lord Robert Cecil, who at that point had some appointed position in the Ministry of State in England, but his real power, of course, was his status as I think at that time the head of the Cecil family, and he was the leading proponent of the League of Nations, and everybody knew it. And when later he was awarded a Nobel Prize for his role in starting the League of Nations, nobody said, oh, gee, why didn't we give this Nobel Prize to Woodrow Wilson? I mean, nobody thought that. That's what we think nowadays after generations of phony schooling and being told and given the impression that Woodrow Wilson somehow was the author of all this and the mastermind. But that's just one example of the kinds of people who might be at the head of the snake. I found it very striking that this Judge Cohalan just named a name, and he said the Cecil family. And if you look at the works of Carroll Quigley, you'll see that he talks a great deal about the Cecil family and their enormous power and influence in Britain, and how they were essentially in control of this roundtable movement that I've been talking about, and of which our modern world and its global governance system, which is getting stronger every day, is a product. We are a product directly of the British Roundtable movement. That is now indisputable. More and more people are writing books about it, even very mainstream people. And more particularly, if Judge Cohalan's sworn testimony before the U.S. Senate is to be believed, at least one of the families who is behind that remarkable development in 20th century history, the creation of global government and the incorporation of the United States of America into said global government, if Judge Cohalan is to be believed, at least one of those oligarchical families is the Cecil family. And what is interesting about that, to me in particular, is that we have been led to believe, to expect names like Rothschild, for example, or right. Warburg, or whatever, the names of Jewish banking dynasties to be named as the quote-unquote head of the snake. And I'm not going to speculate on to what extent those families are or are not at the highest levels of power. But I will tell you this, that there has been a concerted effort specifically by the British establishment, the British aristocracy, to put Jewish figures front and center in public opinion and to give people the impression that Jews and Jewish bankers are, in fact, the ones who are running everything. And the fact that this has been done deliberately, and you can show that it's been done deliberately, at least back into the 1840s, that it's been done officially through official organs of propaganda, through the British government. The fact that so much effort has been focused on putting people before us, such as the Rothschilds, and giving us the impression that these are the ones we should be looking at, well, it's a case of look here, don't look there. That, to me, is evidence that they are not at the top of the ladder. And so when a name like Cecil comes up unexpectedly in 1919 testimony before the U.S. Senate, that gets my attention, because that's not a name that we've been encouraged over and over and over again through the generations to focus on. It's a name that's been largely hidden from us. And so it's my assumption that this is at least a clue that when you run into a name like that that's not familiar with you, to you, there's a good chance that's a much more important name than some of these other names that everybody talks about and everybody claims to know that they're the ones.
Mm-hmm.
Because my understanding of history and human nature is that people who hold real power don't flaunt it.
That's correct.
They don't let you know about it. So the mere ubiquitousness of some of these names that we hear, and David Rockefeller used to be one some years back when he was still with us. Everything you read, I remember when I first started reading, let's say, conspiratorial types of writings, and I'm talking about, a book called Trilateralism by Holly Sklar, which is actually an academic book. I call it conspiratorial simply because it's asking the question of who really runs things in this world, trying to go behind the superficial. Behind
Well, I
the
think they
headlines.
call anything outside of the mainstream, they'd really just call conspiratorial. It's kind of a catch-all in some ways.
Right. So from that time in, let's say, the late 70s when I was in college, and the early 80s when I really started delving into these questions. And a lot of the books I was reading then were from a left-wing point of view. Holly Sklar's Trilateralism, Friendly Fascism by Bertram Gross were two very important ones. David Rockefeller was always named as the top dog. If somebody was the head of the snake, it was him. He was always mentioned in all the conspiracy books, always in the news, but especially anything conspiratorial. And it was not just on the left, it was on the right. There was almost complete unanimity that David Rockefeller and Jacob Rothschild were the two most important and powerful men in the world. And David Rockefeller is dead, presumably. Nowadays, you never really know who's dead and who's alive, just because it was reported on the news.
Right.
Jacob Rothschild presumably is still with us. But I've been hearing about those two since the late 70s as supposedly the top dogs. So the point I'm making is, if we're being told by right and left alike and by mainstream news that these men are hugely important, one has to say why. Why are we always being presented with these two individuals? And if they really held this kind of power, and if they were really the most important people in this hierarchy of power, why are they so public? Why would they even allow themselves? Why would they allow their names to be bandied about that way? And, if you look at one of the main devices that's used to control people's speech on the internet, is to say, well, if you criticize such and such a person, they're going to start getting death threats, and then you'll be responsible for it. Well, how many death threats have David Rockefeller and Jacob Rothschild gotten through the years? Has anybody ever said stop talking about them because they're going to get death threats? I'm sure they get them. I mean, everybody gets them. I've gotten a few. If you're outspoken, you'll get them.
Yeah, we've gotten some really mean ones on Twitter and YouTube. So it's there's some really interesting ways people say they want to harm me.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. It's never very nice. But my point is, it just seems that certain people are approved to be the public bad guys. And David Rockefeller, Jacob Rothschild, and George Soros are right at the top of that list. And there are others. So all this as a kind of long-winded reply to your question, who do I think is the head of the snake? I would tend to think that the names that we hear least about, the families we hear the least about, are most likely to be the most important. Now, having said that, the question of the royal family, I think, is worth looking at, and not just the British royal family, although obviously they're the dominant one in the world today. But it's important to understand, if we think somebody like Bill Gates is important, why? Because he's a multi-billionaire. And if we think someone like Elon Musk is important for the same reason, And if we think they have power, and if we think they have real power, and that seems to be the presumption most people have, then we need to stop dismissing the power of the British royal family, because nobody knows how much money they have, first of all. We're told how much Bill Gates supposedly has. We're told how much Elon Musk supposedly has, but we don't know how much they have either, because there's an elaborate system of tax havens, and there are elaborate and very reliable procedures known to every high-level accountant for hiding vast sums of money in such a way that they'll never be found, and especially by using offshore tax havens and shell companies, putting one company within another, and then at the center of the nesting doll, you find some enigmatic thing, some sort of trust, a blind trust, some kind of trust that can't be traced. But you'll never even get that far, because it's within a shell company, within a shell company, within a shell company, all hidden in some offshore tax haven, where a country, let's say, or a member of the British Commonwealth, or some country deemed to be independent and deemed to be sovereign, which has laws completely preventing any kind of transparency. And so the super rich people of this world know how to use the system. It was made for them. And so it's not only the royal families, but it's any person of great wealth. The first thing they learn, the first thing they're taught is how to use the system to hide their wealth, so that we don't have the slightest idea how much they have. And in the case of the royal families, let's take the British royal family, which is the most important. They get intelligence briefings. The British monarch, King Charles now, he gets regular intelligence briefings at the highest level. He knows whatever MI6 knows, whatever British intelligence knows, he's briefed on it. And he has countless billions, undoubtedly trillions. I mean, logically, he must have trillions, because his family has been investing in colonization and exploration for 500 years. They helped to build our modern world, and they were ground floor investors in that colossal enterprise of conquering, colonizing, and developing the entire world. The amount of money they have must surely be in the trillions, and they have all that money, and they have all that inside information, and they have all these privileges protecting them from any sort of transparency or investigation. Well, how many people are going to refrain from using that inside knowledge to further enrich themselves? I mean, that's the entire purpose of their existence as royals, is to get the lion's share of everything, the lion's share of information from the most sensitive intelligence reports. And if you have that, and you have the kinds of money they have to throw around, the kinds of resources, think what you can do with that money. And so I can only say that even if the royals, let's say the British royals, but not them exclusively, even if they had nothing but their privileged position and their access to classified intelligence and huge amounts of money that they have hidden in offshore banking havens, that alone would make them among the most powerful people on earth. Even if they didn't wear ermine robes and put on crowns on occasion, go prancing through the streets, in ceremonies and rituals, even if they didn't have all that, even if they remained hidden, their job is not to remain hidden. Their job is to be in public. But I'm just saying, if we accept that some person like Bill Gates, who supposedly, when a college student invented some little piece of software and sold it out of his garage or whatever his story is, and then just made all this money. Now he's one of the most powerful people in the world, and he's letting loose bioengineered mosquitoes to bite everybody and inject God knows what into our veins, and nobody can stop him because, gosh, he's so rich. I don't know.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
The Wellness Company and their doctors are medical professionals you can trust. And their new medical emergency kits are the gold standard when it comes to keeping you safe and healthy. This medical emergency kit contains an assortment of life-saving medications, including ivermectin, Z-Pak. Rest assured, knowing that you have emergency antibiotics, antivirals, and antiparasitics on hand to help you and your family stay safe from whatever life throws at you next.
So you can support the Wellness Company by heading over to twc.health/JRS. That is twc.health/JRS. Get up to 15% off select products. Support the Wellness Company and help support this show. Thanks again.
No, I guess looking at it then, you mentioned Soros, and I guess that a large part of our conversation last time was about that. It seems like now he's largely out of the picture, I guess from what we believe, right? Like it may be different from what's actually public. And it seems like his son Alexander has taken, I guess, the family, control of the family in some way. Do you think Alexander actually matters on the world stage, or how do you think like him as a player actually matters?
Well, I think he's a figurehead, like his father, only more so. I mean, George Soros is 93 years old, I think, and he hasn't been looking so well for a while. I don't think he's been actively.
I heard one of his last speeches,
much.
Richard, and it was, I know he has a heavy accent, but it was almost impossible to understand what he was saying.
Yeah, he hasn't looked in the pink for quite some years. I doubt very much whether he has the energy or possibly even the cognitive function to be doing much of anything for the last few years. But he's part of an organization, and so is his son, Alex. So now they're doing a psyop where they're pretending, oh, the baton has passed to this guy, Alex Soros. And, Soros, Alex, from what I understand, he's kind of a playboy. I mean, what he's known for, as far as I can tell, is showing up at all the right parties in Hollywood and the Hamptons and hanging around with celebrities and doing that kind of thing. If he does have any serious endeavors or talents or interests, he hasn't given much evidence of them so far. And that's not to say that he doesn't have talents or interests or capabilities, but
sure,
that's not why he was given this job. In my opinion, he's a figurehead, and he was put there for the same reason his father was put there, to be a figure that people can blame everything on and to hate. And then the ADL and whoever else is in the business of being professionally indignant can say, oh my gosh, how dare you say these things about Alex Soros, just like you said about his father. Oh my gosh, my gosh. But in fact, the person who undoubtedly is actually running the Open Society Foundations has got to be its president, who's a guy named Lord Mark Malloch Brown. And excuse me. Mark Malloch Brown, according to the official story, had first met Soros back in 1986. He first approached Soros. He claims himself. He said it in an interview, Malloch Brown. He first approached Soros and introduced himself because he wanted Soros's help in overthrowing some government. I think it may have been in the Philippines.
Mm-mm.
And
oh, it's funny. I'm wearing my Manila shirt today.
Well, there you go. It's significant. But Malloch Brown, his father was a South African diplomat, so he's involved in the world of diplomacy, foreign relations, intelligence, literally from birth. And he has spent his entire life in that world. And most of his activity, as far as I can tell, has been covert activity of one sort or another, especially destabilizing countries and overthrowing their governments. Regime change is his specialty. And since he first met Soros in 1986, they've become very, very good friends and have worked together almost continuously ever since in overthrowing many governments and doing all kinds of nefarious things around the world. So Lord Mark Malloch Brown is a professional. He is a real professional with vast experience in the very areas in which the Open Society Foundations are involved, and that would be destabilization, economic warfare, psychological operations, regime change. This is what the OSF does. This is what Malloch Brown does. And Malloch Brown is the president of the OSF. He was, previous to that, he was briefly appointed CEO of Smartmatic, a company.
Voting machine company.
Yes. And when he first took over, and I think it was in 2015, Malloch Brown, one of his biggest priorities was trying to sell the United States on the idea of quote unquote internet-based voting, that he was selling voting systems that worked over the internet, something which more recently, since the election fiasco of 2020, we've had tremendous arguments about whether there even is such a thing as internet-based voting. You know, it's become artificially a bone of contention, but you can look at articles from 2015 where Malloch Brown was openly pitching this as a great benefit. This is the voting system of the future. Buy my Smartmatic machines, buy my software. And he was especially pushing this on the U.S. Now, I guess I should warn you, Jeremy, as I'm sure you know, Smartmatic is one of those companies that's been going around suing people for talking about the 2020 election. So I invite you to tell me to shut up at any time. But let me just sum up by saying that from 2015 until after the 2020 election, Lord Mark Malloch Brown, a guy who's spent his entire life specializing in regime change operations all over the world, he was the CEO of Smartmatic. And then the election was over, and then Soros appointed him president of the Open Society Foundations. So it looks to me as if, having successfully completed his mission at Smartmatic, he was then rewarded by being put in charge of the whole quote-unquote Soros network of the Open Society Foundations, a position he's held since late 2020. So he's been quietly in the background doing God knows what as president, and now Alex Soros has been appointed as chairman of the board of OSF. Well, you know, typically in a corporate structure, the chairman is not really in an operational role. The president is. That's how it usually works. So it doesn't even require much speculation to say that Malloch Brown is the one who's most probably doing the heavy lifting. But even if it weren't for the titles they hold, just who they are, the kind of experience that Malloch Brown brings to bear, and his decades-long relationship with George Soros, Malloch Brown literally helped George Soros build the Open Society network that exists today. So it's only natural that he would be the one to receive the torch. Alex receives a symbolic torch as Soros' son. But again, so far, until he does something to prove otherwise, it looks like most of his expertise is hobnobbing in the Hamptons in Hollywood. with celebrities. So let's see if he can leverage that into something a little more serious.
Mm-hmm. Well, Richard, I have a few more things I want to get into, but let me just ask you, how are you doing on time? Because I want to make sure I get you out when you need to be out.
I got some time.
Okay, good. So the thing I wanted to, I feel like we spent most of the conversation handling all the questions we had from last time. So I think we've successfully done that. Now, the thing I wanted to get into is when you and I connected before this conversation, you said one of the things we really needed to take a look at as relates to this is a subject called multipolarism. And you said, really, this is one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with right now. So I want to start first of all with how you would define multipolarism and what is the issues we're dealing with as it relates to it.
Well, multipolarism basically means instead of having one single global power, one global hegemon like the United States supposedly is, ruling the world and everybody else being our supposed vassals. Supposedly, the idea of multipolarism is to remove the evil hegemon, in this case the United States, or to take us down a peg, reduce our power, and to allow other countries a place at the table to share power with a number of other countries. And right now we have the so-called BRICS emerging to take that role. And BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China.
India, China, and South Africa. And now they're talking about bringing in other countries into it. But originally, when it was first, this idea was first promulgated in 2001, those were the countries who were called the BRICS. And so for obvious reasons, China would be the leader of this group and maybe Russia in some sort of second place. And so what you have, if you go on Twitter, you see a strange phenomenon where the so-called influencers of right-wing Twitter, as it's called, the ones who are supposedly conservative or pro-Trump or whatever, are almost overwhelmingly unanimous in saying, yes, down with the globalist American empire, as they call it, GAE for short, gay for short. And up with the BRICS and China in particular, and a lot of praise for China. So all the cool kids on Twitter are pushing this multipolarism thing. Whenever you see such familiar phrases on Twitter as, well, in a serious country like China, you'd never see this kind of thing. And so, for example, they'll show you a video of, people causing some violent disturbance in a Kentucky Fried Chicken someplace, or something like that. And someone will always come in and say, they'd know what to do with these people in China. China would know how to handle this because any serious country like China. So this is the in terms of social media culture, this is the multipolarism talk. Whenever you see somebody saying, well, in a serious country, we'd know how to deal with this. And so a big part of the multipolarist narrative is that China is a superior country to the United States, a better country, a freer country, a saner, more rational country, and that all the BRICS, China, Russia, India, Brazil, that they will all do a much better job of ruling the world than the United States. And so it's very interesting to see this coming from the right and seeing it coming so overwhelmingly and almost unanimously. It's very rare to see anyone dissenting from this view on Twitter. I think I struggle with that in some ways, though, Richard, because I think that the thing I struggle with is I don't know if as a country, we should be kind of going around and kind of getting in all these wars and stuff like we have been. But at the same time, I don't want to see our dollar crash. And I don't necessarily think that these other countries are I don't want to say democracy because I think that's a dirty word, but they're not bastions of republicanism, right? They're not bastions of freedom. So it's this, I see what you're saying, but also at the same time, I struggle to think that I don't see these countries as better, I guess, is a way. I don't see them as better, but I also don't want to see our country causing war. You get what I'm trying to say?
Of course. And that's, I mean, first of all, we all feel that way. Mm-hmm. And that's why it has a propaganda appeal, because Americans traditionally and typically have been extremely patriotic and great believers in our country. And the whole world has tended to share that view that America is the land of plenty, the land of freedom. And despite so much anti-American invective, which has been going on for generations, so many people still want to come here and live here because they know in their hearts that this is a good place to be. But what's happening now is that because of this great reset and the climate agenda and, the sudden emergence of these mysterious pandemics and other factors and forces, it's now become very easy. Whether it's true or not, it's become very easy propagandistically to support the narrative that, well, America isn't what it used to be. Maybe it used to be free, but it's obviously not now. It's becoming easier and easier to say that and to raise the question, would we actually be freer in a country like China or Russia or India or Brazil? And a lot of psyops are being run by our own government for the purpose of making us doubt our country and doubt whether we are a good country and whether we are even a free country anymore. And this is all part of the agenda to break the power of the United States and ultimately, I believe, to actually split up the United States into many pieces via the so-called national divorce movement. Mm-hmm. Now, again, in a country such as ours, which seems to be, headed towards the dark side very quickly, and everybody's getting very scared, the idea that free speech is no longer tolerated, that people are going to get heavy jail sentences for things like political demonstrations, or even posting things on social media. This is something we haven't experienced at least the last couple generations of Americans. We haven't experienced major crackdowns on free speech, such as happened during, let's say, World War I. Excuse me.
I was just going to say that back Wilson. To the Alien and Sedition Acts under Wilson.
Right. There have been very severe crackdowns on free speech in the American past because of wars, because of so-called Red Scares and other temporary phenomena, usually wars. But our generation hasn't seen that for a while, so it looks really, really scary to us. And so it's easy for propagandists, we call them influencers now, to use this doubt and this fear that's setting in and saying, look, we'd better split up the country. Let's get rid of those, get away from those crazy blue state people. Let them have New York. New York isn't worth saving, and we'll all go to Oklahoma or someplace and we'll live happily ever after. And this is very appealing if you just if staying safe, not being arrested, not being harassed, not being potentially killed, is your goal. And for a lot of the people who support national divorce, one of their biggest goals is to avoid civil war. They say, well, this is the only way to deal with this problem of America splitting into two hostile camps and to do it peacefully instead of having a civil war.
I think they seem to forget. They seem to forget that's actually how the Civil War happened, right? Like, the South said, "Oh, we're going to form our own government." Jefferson Davis is in charge. This is our new Senate, and Abraham Lincoln said, "You're not going anywhere," right? So I think at the same time, I think to believe that, like, you don't understand history, right? And I think at the same time, to kind of disintegrate our country to that level. Sure, we love Canada and we love these other countries, but if America got weak, why wouldn't they say, oh, well, we can take Washington State, or, Michigan sounds good. Like, if you break down not to say I'm really into the idea of having a federal government, but it is there for a reason for us to collaborate across countries.
Right. And this is where it becomes very important to identify who is the bad guy, who is the head of the snake, quote unquote, as you put it, because there's really only one of two possibilities. Either it's true, excuse me, either it's true that our country is falling apart and that we've outlived our natural lifespan. That's what people are saying. And the only thing we can do is just let it go and let some young, vigorous country like China. I don't know how China ever became a young country since it's thousands of years old. But, let the next in line come in and take over and see if they can do a better job. This is what you see from so many of these influencers on Twitter with so many thousands, hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of followers. It's amazing how many they have. And considering what they're saying. And so either that's true, either the United States has just lived out its lifespan and there's no hope in saving it. Either that's true, or else there's another possibility that maybe there's actually nothing really fundamentally wrong with the United States. Maybe we're just as good, just as free, and just as potentially powerful and capable of a nation as we always were. But maybe we have an enemy within. Maybe we have forces working within our system who are undermining us from within. And it must be from within, because a country such as ours cannot be destroyed from without. It can only be destroyed by people infiltrating from within, people who have won our trust and attain very high levels of power and influence within our own system, but who in fact are working for evil powers which are hostile to our nation. And you can call that a conspiratorial point of view, but this is the view that I believe. And it is my contention that if anyone is responsible for the state our country is in today, it is the British. It is the British establishment. I don't mean the British people, obviously.
Sure.
Ordinary people are completely innocent of these kinds of intrigues at very high government levels. It's excuse me, it's intelligence agencies, it's departments of state, things at a very high level that most people have no access to. But the thing about the British, as I explained before, is that they created the system of global governance under which we are now living. The United Nations, the WHO, and all these other transnational organizations which are becoming more and more powerful and more intrusive on our lives. They did it. And in fact, Richard Moore, who took over as head of MI6 late last year, he actually announced publicly, somewhat unusually, to go public with something like this. He said that the number one priority of the United Kingdom was to push the climate change agenda, basically the World Economic Forum agenda all over the world, and that MI6 would be there helping them to do it, and targeting especially very powerful, important, industrialized, developed countries, such as ours. Excuse me. So when you have MI6 and publicly announcing this is their goal, that somehow they're going to influence us to abandon our traditional concerns as a nation and take up this new and novel concern of doing whatever Klaus Schwab says we should do, no matter how bizarre, ridiculous, or horrifying it might be. And you have the head of MI6 saying this is their goal, literally to make us do that. Well, some people are programmed to think, why should we listen to them? They're British. They're just some little country, and they're the lapdog of the United States, and they just do whatever we tell them. But I look at it from a different perspective. I look at that same country, Great Britain, and I say, no, this is the country that announced in their various books and articles and what have you, especially with special intensity in the 1890s and 1900s, saying, we're going to create a global government and we're going to bring the United States into our system. And then they did it. That is not a lapdog. That is not a vassal of the United States. That is a country which publicly announced that they were going to bring the United States into their British system, whether we liked it or not. And then they actually did it. They actually did it.
So let me ask you this then, Richard, because I think when people hear this, you mentioned, the propaganda being everywhere. And I feel like as an individual, like you hear all these different things, you see all these different things, and you can feel very powerless as an individual. And especially hearing, okay, it's this external force, outside of even our country. That is the thing. And I guess for the individual listening, what can they do to feel a little bit more causative and a little less effect? Like, what can people do, hearing this information from you and moving forward?
I have to say that because of the fundamental corruption of our voting system, because of the fundamental corruption of our voting system, obviously it's not enough to say, well, go out there and vote for the candidate you choose. Things have reached a point where we need a national reform, a cleansing on a very profound level. Quite often in other countries, when things reach this level of corruption, one of the strategies that's tried is a truth commission. And I have heard people talking about that now and then. I don't know how seriously, but a truth commission is basically a situation where everybody agrees as a nation that they say, look, we don't want a bloodbath. We don't want a civil war. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a massive nationwide investigation to bring out all the truth, all the crimes. But the key to this truth commission, and a lot of people hearing this won't like this, but the key is that the culprits will be granted immunity. That
I've heard that said before, because if you're in a situation like we're in now, where one political party indicts and jails and the other party indicts and jails, there's kind of like this, we're never going to get anywhere. You kind of got to say, these are our sins, mea culpa, let's not do this again.
Well, right. And it does work. I'm not going to say it always works, but this has worked in many countries where they've had military coups. They've had all kinds of terrible things happen. And then somehow the way they got out was through a truth commission. And so what happens is when you tell the bad guys, we're going to give you immunity. We're not going to arrest you. We're not going to put you in jail. We're not going to execute you, even though you deserve it. You will have lifelong immunity, but you have to cooperate with the Truth Commission and you have to tell the truth. And so the truth comes out and everybody learns the truth. Usually people are quite horrified by the truth. And I have what might be thought of as a naive point of view, that when people really know all the facts, when they really, really know, and they're not being bombarded by contrary propaganda saying, don't believe that, that's a conspiracy theory. But once you actually have some kind of authoritative group, such as a Truth Commission, and people coming forward, whistleblowers, and even the culprits themselves confessing what they actually did, which they, of course, would only do if they knew they had immunity. When you have a situation like that, a special kind of dynamic kicks in, and it does work. It really does work sometimes. So to me, that seems one way plausibly to get out of this. Maybe. I don't really know. But sure. To me, it seems the most attractive way, because there's a lot of people out there, I'm not going to name any names, but some very prominent people talking about, arresting people, executing people for treason, capital punishment, sending them to Gitmo, et cetera, et cetera. And there's been a lot of agitprop on this idea of no mercy for the evildoers. And that's, it's understandable why people would want that, given the horrendous things that are going on and that are rumored to be going on behind the scenes.
Sure.
But that's not how you get people to surrender. Whether you're talking about Sun Tzu's Art of War, the famous military manual from ancient China, or whether you're talking about Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War. Julius Caesar was a ferocious warrior. He didn't hesitate to kill, and he was very good at killing. He was very good at fighting, but he was known for his clemency, and he wasn't clement toward people. He didn't show them clemency because he was soft-hearted or anything like that. He did it because it was good military strategy. Because if you go to a Gallic army, let's say, or a Gallic province that's up in rebellion, and you say, I'm going to come in there and I'm going to slaughter every man, woman, and child, they will fight to the death.
Yes.
Because they know what's going to happen if
they have
lose.
Nothing else to fight for otherwise. I think it's really important. And the difficulty with it, Richard, is I do feel like I agree. I think that's a way to solve it, but I do feel like there has to be. I think punishment isn't. You're correct. There doesn't have to be punishment, but I think there has to be some sort of atonement. Do you get what I'm saying? Because,
of course,
as a society, we hopefully exchange with each other in even ways. Hopefully we exchange with each other better. But a lot of times when people are taking, right, that's criminal exchange, right? They're taking. So I think in some ways they have to contribute more than a regular society member to get back into exchange with society. Does that make sense what I'm trying to explain?
Oh, yes, of course. But see, that all comes from the information coming out. Once the crimes are known and confessed to, and the full horror has been made known to people, including how much money has been stolen and things like that. Once that information is known, the outrage of the people will work a magic of its own, and solutions will be found. I'm quite sure. But the thing that is critical, in my opinion, is and I cited Sun Tzu, and I cited Julius Caesar. I'll cite Genghis Khan as well, who most people think of him as the cruelest, most bloodthirsty man who ever lived. But when the Mongols approached a town, they always made the same offer. They said, open your gates and let us in, and you will all be spared. We won't kill a single one of you.
The Persians did the exact same thing, an offering of blood and treasure, and we won't kill you.
Exactly. But if you fight us, the Mongols said, we will not only kill you, we will kill you in the cruelest, most sadistically inventive ways we can possibly imagine. And so this is not soft-heartedness that I'm talking about. When I speak of Sun Tzu, Julius Caesar, and Genghis Khan, these are not liberals. These are not these are not soft-hearted people. These are
Sure.
some of the most ferocious warriors who ever lived, and this is how they won. Mm-hmm. They won by offering mercy to those who surrendered. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to look at the wisdom of these great warriors of the past and consider whether something like that may work in our country. Mm-hmm. I hope it will, because the alternative will be really quite horrible for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think too. Are you familiar with? I'm not promoting this, but are you familiar with the Roman practice of decimation in Roman armies?
Yes.
Decem coming from the word in Latin meaning 10. The Roman generals, like if they had like a mutiny or something like that, they would, either kill or discipline every 10th man, because then the others would say, okay, I've been granted clemency because of that. It was more of an example in that they were spared. So I think, like you're saying, it is important, I think, to offer contrition, because if there is no contrition, there is no solution, right? We're just making things worse than they already are.
Right. And I can only repeat what I said, that once the nature of the crimes is known, the certain solutions, I think, will offer themselves. There must be atonement. There must be amends. And who knows what course that may take.
Sure.
You were telling me that you're a student of the classics. And so I'm sure you've read Caesar's commentaries. And there was one province of Gaul. Right. There was one province of Gaul. I forget who they were, but I think they rebelled 3 times. And each time Caesar was very gentle with them. He reconquered them. He said, don't do that again. And then the 3rd time they did it, he reconquered them and he cut off the right hand of all their men. So they basically couldn't do it again.
Right.
And still he didn't kill them. He didn't kill them, but he cut off their right hands. And that certainly sent a message to any of the other Gauls who thought, oh, look, he's so soft. He's sparing these people again and again, but he cut off their hands. So we have to learn from the ancients.
Yes. Well, Richard, I've really enjoyed this conversation. We definitely have to have you back on again. As I said, there's been popular demand for, the amount of research you've done and your ability to quote this stuff from memory is incredible. So for people listening, if they want to connect with you, if they want to follow you, how's going to be the best way for our listeners to do that?
Well, I'm on Substack. I'm on Twitter, or X as it's now called, which hopefully will continue to survive.